Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Curiosity Stream. I was 16 in 2009, and the Star Trek reboot was pretty easily my most anticipated movie event of the year. Every element of it had me excited. First off, I've always loved Trek. I grew up on reruns of Next Generation and the original series, and they had a big impact on the way I thought about TV and even storytelling itself. Like, I remember exactly where I was when I watched Riker order an attack on the Borg cube after Picard is turned at the end of Best of Both Worlds Part 1. So just the prospect of returning to the franchise after Enterprise and Nemesis managed to put it to rest for a while was exciting enough. Add to that the fact that, at the time, I was also a huge fan of J.J. Abrams thanks to his work on Alias, Mission Impossible 3, and The Lost Pilot, and I was completely ready to be blown away. Now, this is usually where I'd say, sadly, the movie didn't really live up to those expectations. But here's the thing, at the time, it absolutely did. I watched this thing over and over again that year, and it's still a movie I remember really fondly. But how does it hold up over 10 years later, and with the context of the rest of the reboot series to go off of? Well, that's what I want to talk about this week.
You have just entered a new dimension of play. Star Trek: The Next Generation. Action figures, phasers.
I painted a very rosy picture of how I received this movie back when it came out, but I should probably backtrack and talk about something that did actually annoy me, even then. J.J. Abrams' infamous appearance on The Daily Show, where he tried to go out of his way to say that the movie isn't just for Star Trek fans. In fact, he himself never even liked Star Trek. That was kind of the tone for the whole marketing campaign. You know that old boring show your grandpa likes? Well, it's cool now, and there are explosions and yelling and great CG. But to be fair, it was kind of just a more aggressive version of a cycle that seems to kick off almost every time they promote a new Star Trek movie. The 2009 movie is so desperate to be thought of as not your parents' Star Trek in the same way that, like, Star Trek First Contact is. That movie was well aware of Star Trek's talky, nerdy reputation and tried to give a mass audience a big, broad action movie instead, which gave us some truly embarrassing moments in a movie that I do have a big soft spot for.
Assimilate this.
The difference was that the previous attempts to make Trek a slick action franchise all had a relatively small budget to deal with. The Next Generation films can try to feel like an Alien movie as much as they want, but at the end of the day, they were still fairly cheap films that had to reuse sets and costumes from the TV series, as well as use a group of actors that wasn't really cast with movie action in mind. Star Trek 09 didn't have that baggage. It was able to cast a bunch of attractive young stars and spend more than double the budget of any previous Trek movie to give audiences an action spectacle unlike anything the franchise had been able to do up until that point. So, of course, the studio was hell-bent on the movie trying to appeal to far more people than just Trek fans. And looking at the movie now, I think it largely succeeds. Like that opening, which I still think is one of the best opening scenes in a blockbuster in the past 20 years. We see Kirk's father, played by a then unknown Chris Hemsworth, sacrifice himself as his pregnant wife gives birth during a ship evacuation, all set to a really great score. Right away, this felt very different from the Star Trek I knew, for a few reasons, the most immediate being just how it was shot and edited. Star Trek had never been edited like this. The TV shows just never would have been by virtue of being older TV shows, but even the great Trek movies like Wrath of Khan or The Undiscovered Country never had that sense of visceral urgency in quite the same way. Despite the spaceships and the villains, those movies are often just quiet character pieces, at least in comparison to this. A lot of Star Trek on TV and film before this was filmed with contemplative conversations, debates over the morality of their situation, or what strategic moves they could make with the options they had at hand. Here, that almost never feels like the case. Characters are forced to make fast, exciting choices because of the urgency of their situations. And when they do have arguments about tactics or just what they should do, gone are the witty, professional discussions of the original series. These guys do not have time for that. They're yelling at each other and they're almost ready to punch each other in the face almost immediately. Now, obviously the movie kind of has an excuse for this. They're the younger version of their future, more mature selves, but it still makes the film feel entirely different from what came before. And by the way, that's not always a bad thing. That sense of urgency helps this movie at times, like in that opening scene. Other times, it kind of feels like a way to brush past lazy writing, so that's kind of the trade-off. There had been some great, suspenseful moments in past Star Trek, but this brought a fast-cutting style that made everything feel visceral and emotional right up front, in a way that's a lot more accessible to general audiences. Though, I would argue that Kirk having to reckon with his hatred of the Klingons, who he still blames for the murder of his son, as the Federation tries to make peace with them in Star Trek VI, is a far more morally complex and compelling emotional story for the character than anything he's dealing with in this film. But the 2009 film makes his journey much more blunt. He's trying to live up to his dead heroic father, and it gives the character a simple, overarching narrative that can get people on board immediately. And right there is what makes this movie so weird for me to think about now. What it sets out to do, reintroduce the original cast through a modern lens that a broad audience finds more accessible, it pretty much nails. The cast is great, especially Quinto Spock, who is able to channel Leonard Nimoy's performance amazingly well, even if this Spock is far more emotional than the one we've met before. Pine's Kirk I'm a little less sold on, not because I don't like him as an actor, I just don't really like how this script handles Kirk. I get he's supposed to be a bit more immature than he is later on, but he comes off as lazy and stupid in a way that the Kirk I knew never really did. The biggest upgrade though is probably the secondary cast. Nothing against the old cast, who all had solid, professional TV actor chops, but the versions we get here are just more dynamic characters. And actors like Zoe Saldana and Anton Yelchin just get far more to do than Uhura and Chekhov basically ever did in the past. Karl Urban is also a lot of fun as Dr. McCoy, even if his role actually feels a little reduced compared to DeForest Kelley's. Overall though, I have zero complaints with this cast, and I think casting has always been one of Abrams' biggest strengths. If you've noticed though that I've spent a lot of time talking about tone and about the cast and not like the actual story, there's a pretty good reason for that. This script just has almost no substance. Which isn't to say it's a really simple script, because it definitely isn't. It has to do a ton of heavy lifting, introducing us to the new versions of all these characters, catch us up with Nimoy's Spock, give us a new villain, and try to find a way to satisfy the hardcore fans by coming up with an excuse not to disturb the continuity of the original series, which it tries to do by establishing a new timeline in which Vulcan is destroyed after Nero's ship travels back in time. That's one of the weirder things about this movie. Like, the whole marketing lead up to it was to convince casual viewers that you don't have to be a Trekkie to love it, but the film itself tries to bend over backwards just to make sure that Trekkies don't get too mad at them. It's a really tough needle to thread, and when you put all of that together, there just isn't much room for an interesting moral or philosophical conflict in this film. Nero is on a warpath to destroy Earth after the death of his wife, for which he blames Spock and the Federation. It's a very straightforward revenge narrative that had already worn out its welcome in Trek movies when this came out, and has only been beaten into the ground farther since. Nero is barely a character outside the boundless energy that Eric Bana manages to bring to him. I had these issues in 2009 too, but I found it really easy to forgive them. After all, wasn't this movie all about setting things up so the crew can have more fleshed out adventures down the line? Well, that's what made the legacy of this movie a little more complicated for me, because I don't think they ever really did that. The cast continued to be great, but Into Darkness was hobbled by an absolutely terrible script. And I know a lot of people like Beyond a lot, but I kind of thought it felt like a below average episode with some decent action set pieces. That probably sounds harsh, but I don't really mean it to. It's not like the Star Trek film franchise was ever exactly known for releasing A+ movies all the time before the reboot happened. I would still take Beyond over most of the Next Generation films, and even a couple with the original cast. Star Trek 2009 is a movie I can throw on and immediately enjoy. I still think it's better than basically everything Abrams has directed since, and despite my issues, I really do like this movie. The only thing that's really changed is the sense of optimism I felt about the films that would come after this. Because at the end of the day, a big blockbuster film franchise was never going to be able to encompass most of the things that I love about Star Trek. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that any version of the franchise has always been extremely high quality and cerebral drama that the films can never touch, because that's just not the case. Some of the dumbest and most ill-conceived stuff I've ever seen on TV have been in episodes of Star Trek. But what these films do lack is that feeling of limitless possibilities that the old version of the franchise was always so good at instilling in its viewers. Where one episode or film might be goofy and comedic, one could deal with an incredibly heavy topic like genocide, and another could be a really small personal story about one of the characters with an interesting sci-fi twist. And they would all fit together as one vast, exciting universe, bursting at the seams with possibilities and stories. There was always drawbacks, like a limited budget and occasionally terrible makeup and costumes, but when it worked, there was really nothing like it. The blockbuster trilogy manages to sand over most of those rough edges. They look nice and slick and are filled with engaging movie stars. People who would be embarrassed to be caught watching the original series can sit back and have at least two of these films go down as smooth as butter. And there is something to be said for that. But the thing that Star Trek 2009 no longer has is that sense of possibility. There was never going to be sequels to this movie that were going to be willing to be that much weirder, smarter, or goofier than this is. Because the reality of making movies on this scale is they needed to be big, bombastic films that play to the broadest possible crowd. They don't want anyone to be bored, or at any point to think that it's cringy or embarrassing. They accomplished that, but at the cost of losing the spark that made me love Star Trek. This is a franchise that has to be allowed to be boring or embarrassing sometimes, because it's constantly trying interesting things that don't always work. And that's a lot easier in a 22 episode season or even a low budget movie than a $150 million blockbuster that needs to perform at the box office, which is why these movies stick to reproducing the greatest hits, the destruction of Earth and revenge stories. I like Star Trek 2009. It's a movie that I've seen probably a dozen times, but it'll never represent to me what I actually love about Star Trek. And I guess that makes sense, because it was made by someone who was really eager to say that he didn't love it in the first place.
Oh yeah!
So, chances are pretty good that I'll be covering the MCU's return to theaters next week with a video on Black Widow. But if you're in the mood for some Marvel content now, I've got some good news. My video on Ang Lee's Hulk, a fan request that I made a couple years ago and has been unlisted for almost everyone, is now live on Nebula. I had a great time covering that movie, and if you haven't had a chance to check out Nebula yet, now is definitely the time. I upload all my videos there, but I also have exclusive videos on Rick and Morty and Cheers, alongside creators like H Bomber Guy, Nando V Movies, and Just Right. Nebula is doing an amazing job of giving creators an alternative to YouTube and its algorithm. And that's just half the package, because when you sign up for Curiosity Stream, you'll get an email welcoming you to Nebula as well, which makes for an amazing bundle. This month, I've been watching episodes of Besieged Fortresses, a really in-depth series about old castles and how they prepared for war. You combine the history with Curiosity Stream's documentaries on science, tech, and nature, and you have a really great offer. You can get all of this for $14.79 a year. That's a 26% discount. So get the deal by going to curiositystream.com/CaptainMidnight. That's curiositystream.com/CaptainMidnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.